Welcome to The Forgotten, the Armenian Genocide Part 2, A Short Honeymoon. The Berlin-based American historian Nader Sorabi deducts the Young Turk Revolution and its ideals and ideology from the multitude of revolutions taking place in the same time frame. He states that they approved of the swiftness of revolutionary action in the French Revolution, but disapproved of terror and unnecessary bloodshed. They took the achievements of the Ottoman constitutional movement of the 1870s and made them their goal. They outright admired the Meiji Restoration in Japan for its modernizing spirit and its shift towards constitutionalism. They were inspired by the struggle of the Russians against their Tsar and its culmination in the Revolution of 1905, which they saw as the final act in a battle against disdained autocracy, which, much like in the Ottoman Empire, they saw as the core of all problems. Last but not least, they were reinforced in their plans of constitutional revolution by the constitutional revolution in Persia in 1906, that, even in a secularized revolution, speaking the language of holy struggle and martyrdom was essential, as well as the use of newspapers. Taking power had been surprisingly easy for the Young Turk movement and its many supporters. Yet they stood in front of an empire of many nationalities, and they had to give it a working government as soon as possible. So they scheduled the first elections in more than 30 years for the same year and set about to secure their power base by diverting their opponents' attention to infighting. A rather easy measure the Young Turks employed to divide the Armenian populace was preferring one of their political parties over the other. The Social Democrat Hnjak party was quickly legalized and welcomed as a legitimate party. The revolutionary Dashnak Tsutyun was pretty quickly sidelined and kept in illegality. These divide et impera politics made the Armenian parties rather easy to control. The SDHP, in the light of Ottoman support and acceptance, quickly dropped all its subversive activities, which the AIF, enraged by not being accepted into the fold, did keep up, at least to a degree. The Social Democrats, finally left alone by the state and able to do what they saw fit, organized a new set of Armenian identity politics, which tried to create a distinct Armenian culture that was to be a part of the multi-ethnic empire, but distinctly not Ottoman. In fact, the AIF was accepted just in time for election, where it would ally itself with the CUP. Please allow me to have the great Armenian scholar Raymond Harboutian-Kevorkian, the author of the definitive magnum opus on the Armenian Genocide, explain the details of the new Ottoman electoral system to you. To understand why the CUP was able to dominate these elections, we need to examine the electoral law that made the Sanjak the basic electoral district and gave the right to vote to all males 25 and over. The electoral rolls identifying these male voters were established by the imams, priests, muhtars, that's village headmen, and other notables. On the basis of these lists, the Mutasarrif, that is, the prefect, decided how many parliamentary deputies a Sanjak would have, in accordance with the following rules. 1 deputy for an adult male population between 25,000 and 75,000, 2 deputies for an adult male population between 75,000 and 125,000, and so on. Candidates had to be at least 35 years old to be eligible. A parliamentary deputy's term ran for 4 years. Civil servants and officers, if elected to parliament, had to give up their posts. What gave the system a special twist, however, was the fact that each group of 500 voters designated an elector of the first degree, who chose, in turn, an elector of the second degree, in accordance with quantitative criteria. 1 elector for 500 to 750 voters, 2 for 750 to 1,250, and so on. The second-degree electors then met in the administrative seat of the Sanjak in order to elect the members of parliament. A quorum of 80% was required. As a French diplomat who described the system points out, applying these rules led to major difficulties that aggravated still further the absolute non-existence of anything resembling an accurate census. The result was widespread dissatisfactions and distortions in the distributions of seats. The effects of this majority voting system were obvious. In the first elections of the new constitutional era, 288 seats were up for election. Out of those seats, the CUP captured 160. 140 seats went to Turks, 60 to Arabs, 27 to Albanians, 36 to Greeks, 14 to Armenians, 10 to Slavs, and 4 to Jews. The system also assured that no candidate was able to be confirmed in the second round of elections without the direct support of the CUP constituents, and as such allowed the CUP to play all factions out against each other. So, hardly any party was in real opposition to the government. In fact, most parties were too busy with caring about internal matters, and quickly a game of alliances and backstabbing began between different nationalities in parliament. So, in reality, the CUP was able to govern on an easy majority without any need for the parliament. The democratic constitutional political process was pretty much dead on arrival. On 17th December 1908, still Sultan Abdülhamid paraded through Istanbul in a coach, just to enter the parliament he closed more than 30 years ago, and, to great acclaim by the MPs, declared that the old constitution was in effect again. Shortly after the elections, the new government set up a special Ottoman Armenian Committee to settle the old disputes that had led to the Armenian massacres. Opinions on this governmental body differ, but many historians agree that they did indeed improve the situation of the Armenians in the six Sanjaks. It is hard to deny, however, that Turkish nationalism and Turkish hegemony of the imperial institutions was expanding quickly. Legislation was implemented that Turkish was the only language that was to be taught in elementary schools and universities, while local languages were only brought to the students in secondary schools. It is easy to forget how diverse the empire really was. The most recent Ottoman census of 1906-1907, a year before the revolution, figured out a total population of 15.5 million Turks, 2.8 million Greeks, 760,000 Bulgarians, 250,000 Jews, and around 1.03 million Armenians, just to name the 5 most significant population groups. It would be very wrong to assume that I was fine for the CUP. As already mentioned, the party and organization itself was in disarray. It was, undeniably, the single most powerful political element in the Ottoman Empire. By the end of 1909, it consisted of 360 branches, subcommittees if you will, which in turn had over 850,000 members. Yet this amount of members in such a large empire of course caused great divergence. In addition to the aforementioned infighting between authoritarians, liberals and conservatives, the leadership was, apparently, entirely unaware of a different threat sitting at their throats. The focal point were conservative, Sultanist circles, which the Young Turks had tried to woo into their camp after the elections, supported by the clergy, which had never been too enthusiastic about the rather secular party line, please imagine the largest possible air quotes, which, beyond the previously mentioned religious speech, had not too much love for anything spiritual. Those two groups were dead set on restoring the Sultanate to its former glory. It is not hard to believe that the Sultan himself had his hands in this affair too. Despite the great PR stunt of him opening the parliament again, the once mighty potentate was a bit sour about recent developments. In a brilliant essay, which I will come to quote quite a lot during this episode, Armenian historian Bedros Dermetassian sums up the events of the Countercoup, happening on the 13th and 14th of April 1909. The counter-revolution was not a spontaneous outburst by dissatisfied elements in Istanbul. Rather, it was organized by oppositional elements mainly represented by conservative religious circles within the empire. On the night of April 12th, the troops of the 1st Army Corps mutinied and marched toward Hagia Sophia Square, near the parliament, accompanied by a large number of people in religious garb, shouting slogans in favor of the Sultan and demanding the restoration of the Sharia. By royal order, on April 14, Tevfik Pasha was appointed the Grand Vizier and Ismail Kemal was elected the President of Parliament. This was a huge blow to the Committee of Union and Progress, whose members either fled or were hiding. On April 17th, the CUP began to act. The Action Army, left Salonika and headed to Istanbul to restore public order and discipline among the rebellious troops. It established its headquarters at Ayastefanos and began negotiations with the new cabinet. After failed negotiations, the Action Army entered Istanbul on April 23rd and, after several skirmishes, took control of the city. While this episode, as embarrassing as it was for the CUP, did not have too much of a political effect, except for further isolating the Sultan and eventually leading to his abdication and succession by his younger brother Mehmed 2 weeks later, it had a terrible effect on the Young Turk psyche, and, as with many regimes that faced an outbreak of violent opposition, they became paranoid. Some historians argue that the Young Turk Revolution increased the awareness of many Turkish subjects of the empire that there were Syrians, Armenians, Circassians, Georgians, Lebanese, Arabs, and many more different nationalities in the empire, as those opened up new newspapers, were finally allowed to ring their church bells, and in general were ready and willing to express their difference from the Turkish majority much more openly. This expression can easily be found in the number of new periodicals popping up after the revolution. With the absence of any kind of censorship up until 1911, in 1909 alone, more than 200 new periodicals started to appear, many of them published by scholars and interest groups not ethnically Turkish. It can be said that this incredibly quick change inspired distrust, even fear, in many Turks. A fear of losing their superior status and, maybe, even the dominance of their religion. This led to a disastrous event that would destroy the connection the Armenian movements and parties had painstakingly built to the Young Turks over the past decade. A lot of ink has been spilled about the events that took place in Adana, Circassia, a mere day after the start of the counter-revolution. Demirtaşyan makes out two major divergent positions. The first, mostly assumed by Turkish scholars, is that the events were a result of Armenian attempts to build an independent Armenian kingdom, a rather common conspiracy theory of the time that I intend to write a blog post about. The second is that the CUP was working to destroy the Armenian economic and social structures in Circassia as a preparation for coming actions, a position taken by many Armenian scholars. But what had happened? Demirtaşyan describes that, as news of the coup attempt were made public in the city, the many Turkish inhabitants of the city armed themselves with clubs and rifles. Seeing that and remembering the massacres of the last century, the Armenian merchants closed their shops, which, to the Turkish mob looking out for whomever they disliked, be it Sultanists or Young Turks, appeared as if the Armenians were in on it. After everyone had heard the rumors about how the Armenians were planning to attack the Turks and take over the city, the police chief of Adana, a man named Zor Ali, took his force and besieged the Armenian quarter of the city. Shots were fired. It is unclear who started, but it ended in 3 days of clashes and massacres, burning down the Armenian quarter almost entirely, until the Vali reconciled the two factions, but only after tens of thousands had died, Armenians as well as Turkish. The Armenian MPs and other politicians were aghast. The Ottoman government, obviously fearful of the backlash in Western media, was in full damage control mode. They downplayed the casualty figures, engaged in first-class victim blaming, for example by commissioning articles speaking of insurrection, and tried to ensure all consuls and ambassadors that they had the situation under control. That, however, was not the case. On the 25th, army units of the Action Army, which had been assembled to strike down the coup and then marched for Adana to restore order, camped outside the city. During the evening, they were fired upon. By whom? We don't know. But does it really matter? Who do you think got blamed for it? In another 2 days of massacres from the 25th to 27th of April, Action Army units and the usual mob went at it again. In the end, after both events, more than 25,000 people had lost their lives, both Turkish and Armenian, as well as many other nationalities, Kurds, Jews, Circassians, you name it. In a goodwill measure, the Turks organized for the orphans to be educated in the best Turkish schools, which of course humiliated the Armenians even more deeply. After all, they thought they would at least have been allowed to raise their own orphans. Kevorkian sources estimate material losses at around 5.6 million Turkish pounds. Unfortunately, I haven't really found a way to convert that into any contemporary currency, but I am told that it is very, very much. I do not want to take a position in the conflict between the two different positions on what has transpired. I very much think the position that the Armenians wanted to establish their own kingdom is nonsense, but I have not been fully convinced that the CUP instigated what happened to weaken the Armenian position. Maybe it was a misunderstanding after all. Discussing this would take hours, which I would gladly do, but I think it would disturb the narrative a bit too much. If you want me to discuss the two positions in a probably rather lengthy blog post, be sure to contact me on social media or send me an email at theforgottenhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Contemporary Armenians, given the official and semi-official reactions of the Ottoman authorities, were of course highly suspicious. Their main political outlet, the Drozhak, stated in April 1909, "The Young Turks wish to do what great nations with a high level of civilization have not succeeded in doing with ethnic minorities down to the present day. They think that it has suddenly become possible, the curiosity and political absurdity of the matter lies here, for the Ottoman Empire to assimilate, at last, the other ethnic groups, although these groups have a centuries-old cultural heritage and are, collectively, at an incomparably higher intellectual level. They think the empire will at last dissolve them in the predominant Turkism. Young Turkey is attempting to build up, by any and all means, legal and illegal, a totally centralized system under the hegemony of the Turkish elements. A system in which the Ittihadist party will be able to say, like Louis XIV, "L'État, c'est moi." In an even more spiteful, anguished editorial in the Armenian newspaper Pyuzantion, Suren Bartevian, an Armenian journalist, had this to say: "After this bloody trick, how can anyone accuse the supine corpses of people who, this time, could not make the least attempt at self-defense, fire a single shot, or even throw a stone? How are we to describe these deceitful accusations? How are we to understand them? Tell us if you no longer want us to live in this country, or exist on the face of the earth. How long must our blood and tears flow because of a fanciful, half-cocked story of an Armenian kingdom that you do not believe yourselves, because you cannot imagine that the Armenians are stupid enough to believe it in their run?" As it might become apparent, the Armenians were already having doubts about their security in the new empire, and were on the way to take up the same position as they took up against the Sultan. The leadership, however, was still trying to show that Armenia stood firm with the empire, in an attempt to convince the Young Turk leaders of their loyalty. They helped drafting and implementing a bill that abolished the military exemption tax and conscripted Armenians into the army, yet it was to no avail. It became apparent to many leaders of the different millets that the ultra-nationalist circles of the CUP were steadily gaining power. In his aforementioned essay, Dermatosian, sorry for quoting that essay so much, but it's a perfect example of a historical essay done right, talks about the public sphere of the Ottoman Empire, defining a public sphere as a social space in which private citizens gather as a public body with the rights of assembly, association, and expression in order to form public opinion. He states that those spheres had not yet been backed by firm institutions, like a culture of protest or democratic norms of debate culture. So those weak public spheres made it easy for populism and xenophobia to ravage any kind of discourse and allow for such tragic misunderstandings as they occurred in Adana. It is not too hard to transfer that problem to the entire empire. The formerly authoritarian Ottoman Empire had no need of such institutions, and as such, the new freedom of discourse was a little too free. So, whether the Young Turks wanted it or not, their attempts on blaming the Armenians, which were properly read through the entire empire, helped fermenting a new xenophobia against the Armenians. The honeymoon was over, and it was a rather short trip. I want to leave this episode a little shorter, showing the first cracks between Armenians and Young Turks. Next time, we are going to talk about the Ottoman Empire's catastrophic defeats in the Balkan Wars, and how they shaped the Young Turk Party, as well as the situation leading up to the Ottoman entry into the First World War. This series might become a bit longer than I expected, but I want to express my gratitude to all of you for listening. The last episode has been a huge hit, and as university and job life gets a little more relaxed now, I'll try to make the past delays up to you again. In case you haven't noticed yet, I'm putting together blog posts about events or concepts I don't think fit as much into the episode, but still deem important enough to give some insight upon. Be sure to check them out at theforgottenhistorypodcast.wordpress.com. Stay healthy, stay inside your homes, and stay safe. I wish you a good day or a good night. See you next time.